Good afternoon. I am Kelly Brown Douglas, Dean of the Episcopal Divinity School at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. Thank you for joining us in another of our conversations on Just Vote as we look toward the November 3rd elections and beyond. I am so happy and privileged to have joining me today in this conversation, Mr. Robbie P. Jones, a friend and colleague, but most importantly, one of the leading voices and scholars when it comes to helping us to understand the changing cultural and political landscape in this country and the role of religion in that changing landscape. He has conducted some of the most significant research and gathered the most telling data when it comes to the implications of faith, in relationship to some of the most pressing issues of our time, such as race, and when it comes to the vote. Robert P. Jones is CEO and founder of the Public Religion Research Institution, formerly known as PPRI, also known as PPRI. And he is author of one of the most important and prescient books for our time, and that is White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity. Robbie, thank you for taking the time to be a part of this conversation with me.
No, I'm always happy to talk to you. So thanks for having me.
Well, let's jump right in because there is a lot to cover. And I want to start with what I find to be one of your most insightful yet provocative statements that we find in your book, White Too Long. And that is this: you said, if you were recruiting for a white supremacist cause on a Sunday morning, you likely would have more success hanging out in the parking lot of an average white Christian church, evangelical Protestant, mainline Protestant, or Catholic, than approaching white sitting out services at the local coffee shop. Now that's quite an indictment of Christianity. What's going on here?
Well, it's such a heartbreaking, sentence to write. Really, I remember I was looking at that sentence on the screen when I wrote it, and realizing that was actually the accurate conclusion from the data that I had sitting before me. I'll say a little bit more about that, and what I think. So the book has kind of three components. It's kind of got a memoir component, a kind of history component, and then a social science component where I'm looking at contemporary public opinion data. And this comes out of that piece. When I'm looking at contemporary attitudes among white Christians, that I found just this consistent pattern and question after question, survey after survey of this gap where white Christians were very consistently holding more racist attitudes than whites who were not Christian. So just to give you a couple of examples, kind of make this concrete on the issue that is sitting so heavily with us, right now, the killing of African-American men by police. We have a survey question we've been asking for a number of years, since 2015, actually, on this question. And what we find is that white Christians, those who identify as Christian, are about twice as likely as whites who are religiously unaffiliated to say that these are just isolated incidents that have nothing to do with one another, rather than part of a pattern of how police treat African Americans. And I can multiply this, and in fact, I do in the book, across 15 different questions. So it's not just this one issue, but it's essentially anything that gets to systemic racism in the country, that you see effectively that Christianity, white Christianity, effectively puts moral blinders on white Christians and really renders this invisible to them. And even when I test for all kinds of other explanations, right, to see, well, maybe it's partisanship, maybe it's not religion, maybe it's partisanship, maybe it's education, maybe it's gender, maybe it's region. But I actually went through and actually tried to break the model that was showing this relationship by putting in all these other controls, even controlling for all these other possible alternative explanations. Even when you put those controls in, this independent relationship between holding more racist attitudes and identifying as a white Christian hold up. And that relationship does not exist among whites who are religiously unaffiliated. So it really is Christian identity that is doing the work here, and that is kind of making this connection between higher racist attitudes and white Christian identity.
Yeah, this is what I find to be one of the most unsettling yet insightful aspects of your research here, this very thorough research that, it's with this white Christian identity that not simply not being able to recognize systemic racism and being more racist, that even in terms of overall racial attitudes, that unaffiliated white persons seem to trend closer toward people of color in racial attitudes and in their attitudes in terms of racial injustice in the society than do white Christians. And so in that regard, it's no surprise then, or we shouldn't be surprised. First, let me hit this matter of policing, where we see, and I've heard you speak about the website and all of the money that was raised, right, in support of the young man who killed protesters out in Wisconsin. That would seem to be commensurate by a white Christian group. That would be compatible or commensurate with the data that you found, that it seems that white Christians are overwhelmingly supportive of Blue Lives Mattering as opposed to Black Lives Mattering. Can you speak to that anymore?
Yeah. No, I think that's right. I mean, I think we're seeing this play out right before our eyes. This really a kind of moral blindness, I think, towards systemic racism. So, what do you see, right, when you look at what's happening in the country? Do you see protests for justice, or do you see rioting and looting? What do you see? Do you see a police officer defending himself, or do you see someone getting shot in the back 7 times when they're unarmed? What do you see when you see someone like Kyle Rittenhouse, who answered a white supremacist militia's call to leave his home state, drive across the state lines to Kenosha, and then ends up killing 2 people? There. Do you see him acting in self-defense, or do you see someone acting, out of a sense of white supremacy? Do you see law and order as the biggest problem in the country, or do you see racial injustice as the biggest problem in the country? And those are all, I think, those fault lines are all right there, and that one of the, I think, heartbreaking things, if you ask people, like, what work does Christianity do with whites? Does it make them less racist? I mean, almost all white Christians would say yes, right? It should make them less racist. But I think the other piece I didn't even mention is, when we looked at church attendance on this front, to answer that question, does maybe these people are just Christian in name only, right? That they just claim to be Christian, but they haven't been formed in Christian discipleship. They haven't listened to a lot of sermons. But what is, I think, is still astonishing is that we found, like, at best, church attendance makes no difference in this among white Christians. So those who attend more frequently and those who attend less frequently, this relationship between holding racist attitudes and identifying as a white Christian remains the same. But if we look at, particularly at white evangelicals, right, the group that I grew up in, that's kind of group that I grew up in, we find actually that attending church more frequently makes things worse in terms of racial attitudes. That those who attend more frequently, that relationship between holding racist attitudes and identifying as white Christians is actually stronger among those who attend more frequently and those who attend less frequently. And what's I think also notable is that if you only ask about whether people feel warmly toward African Americans, these 2 things are simultaneously true for white evangelicals. They simultaneously will say they feel much more warmly than the general population does toward African Americans. And if you look at attendance on that measure, it actually makes things, you get warmer feelings for people who attend more often. And at the same time, they hold more racist attitudes, and those who attend more frequently actually hold higher racist attitudes than those. So these 2 things are true at the same time. And the only thing I think we can say about this from my perch is that there is this, like, deep self-deception among white Christians about where they really are. on issues of race in this country. And I think one of my hopes is that this moment will create such a cognitive dissonance among white Christians that it will just be untenable to try to hold on to both of these things at the same time.
Yeah, well, let's dig into that just a little bit further. This kind of notion of deep self-deception. There clearly seems to be something toxic that makes Christianity toxic, or maybe whiteness more toxic, when these two things come together. And even as you talk about, you see it even more deeply within evangelical Christianity. But what's also very telling in your work and in the data, and we can even see through the last election, that it's not simply about being fundamentalist evangelical Protestant.
That's right.
That this holds across the board for white Christians. So what is it, right, about in the Christian theological architecture that allows for this toxic combination of whiteness and Christianity? It almost leads us to believe, I remember Malcolm X said once that you can't be Black and Christian, but maybe you can't be white and Christian and ought not be white and Christian. What are we to think of this? What's going on here, Robbie? What's it about Christianity that makes it so lethal when it comes together with whiteness, or vice versa?
Yeah, I think we've got a clue from Frederick Douglass, like way back, and from his first autobiography. I think what's often like skipped over and not paid enough attention to is he has an entire appendix at the end of his first autobiography that just excoriates white Christianity for the deep hypocrisy of kind of preaching virtue on the one hand and upholding the cruelty of slavery on the other. And he has this, again, I felt just so disturbed by when I first read it. And again, I should say, look, I've got a PhD in religion, and it wasn't until I started working on this book that I reread the autobiography, and it really sunk into me what he was saying about white Christianity there. And what he basically said is that it was his experience and the experience of most people that he knew who had been enslaved, that to have an owner who was Christian was far worse than to have an owner who was not. Right. And so exactly what you're saying, this kind of coming together of white supremacy and Christianity was actually more lethal than just white supremacy on its own. In fact, he put it like so starkly. He said, look, aside from being enslaved, the worst calamity I could imagine befalling myself would to be owned by a Christian slave master. Like that was the next to being enslaved itself. That was the next worst thing he could imagine. And he explained that there was this kind of psychological thing that happened that whereas before, as he described it, there was like just some basic humanity that might curb the cruelty among whites. But once it got baptized with Christian theology, that basic humanity got short-circuited because it now had a Christian justification, right? You could quote chapter and verse, right, on kind of punishing slaves, on treating them cruelly, like you could, and people did, and I think that's again insight for us that it in fact short circuits in some ways a kind of basic humanity, and that's a sort of damning thing to say, right? That there's a way in which Christian theology in this way has really, Martin Luther King said a very similar thing, right? He talked about like, who are these white Christians in the midst of all these calls for justice, who are sitting safely behind their anesthetizing stained glass windows in a letter from Birmingham jail.
That's right. And that's exactly right. And one of the things, even as you have, your data clearly shows this inability to recognize, or at least to acknowledge systemic racism. And as you talk about this sort of holding two things at once, that evangelicals can feel more warmly toward African Americans, yet at the same time display this sort of level of hatred or white supremacy. There's something, is there not, particularly in this evangelical Protestant tradition, but it's a part of Christian architecture's, theological architecture as well, that this focus on the individual, this focus on individual piety, right? This focus on individual virtue and morality. And so that one can focus on that and talk about being individually saved and pure and virtuous. And that does not allow one then to make that leap. We can talk about individual sin and not see the sort of social sin. And so you have an excuse almost that becomes almost a blind spot.
Yeah, I mean, I'll make this really personal. I mean, it was, when I was really working on the book, and one of the things I was doing is thinking back about my own upbringing and childhood, and like I was at church all the time as a kid. I mean, I was at church like 5 times a week, all the way through my adolescence. I was in the youth group, all of that, and when I realized I not once heard a sermon about civil rights, about social justice and racial inequality, about the role of white churches in resisting, and supporting segregation, and resisting Black calls for equality. Not once did I hear anything about that. Now, how can that be, right? I mean, and I grew up in Jackson, Mississippi in the 70s and 80s, right? And so it speaks to the power of it. So that, but what I did hear every sermon, every service, was about a personal relationship with Jesus. That's what I heard every week, right? And what that did is it created kind of the beginning and the end of religion was about this individualistic personal relationship with Jesus. And as long as I had this kind of interior sense of security, that things were good between me, Jesus, and God in this very individualistic way, everything else gets sort of screened out as the proper realm of religion and Christianity. So it does kind of have this, it really does truncate your moral vision in a way, and you become short-sighted. I think that is one of the biggest things we're struggling with. And while it's more evident, I think in white evangelical circles, it's worth noting, right? My denomination became the dominant expression of, it was the largest Protestant denomination in the country by the middle of the 20th century, right? It became the dominant expression of white Christianity in the country. And United Methodists, who are also heavily in the South, and even Episcopalians, like, it's worth remembering, right? Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis, they were Episcopalians, right? I mean, it is not
Beckwith who bombed the church, right?
Yeah, right. That's right. Yeah. So it's not outside. It's not just an evangelical issue here, and I think that's what the current data shows us, is that it very easily escaped, the bounds of kind of white evangelicalism in the South, and it is very much with white Christian churches, both Protestant and Catholic.
So before we turn to Christians and the vote, let me ask you, you were born and raised in the Southern Baptist tradition. And just as you've articulated and laid bare in your book, this was a tradition very much, if not explicitly, at least gives cover by being silent to issues of racial injustice, etc. A tradition that was a part of what you call sort of a lost cause religion in support of Confederate monuments and the Confederacy. So, Robbie, what was it that allowed you to see and to feel the disconnect and to begin to get on a different, let's say, a conversion experience away from that? What was the catalyst for change for you? How did you grow? How did you change?
Well, I think it's a really long journey. Like I said, it was not until my 20s in seminary that I even knew this Genesis story of the Southern Baptist Convention, right? So that's my early adulthood and it was definitely unsettling for me, but I didn't really know what to do with it, frankly, in that setting. So it just kind of sat back there, and again, kind of creating some kind of cognitive distance. It would come forward, it would recede. So I think it's just been like this kind of experience of stumbling through, but I think for me, honestly, it's really been the last 5 years that have been really, that have brought these things to the fore. And really, so it was, the killing of African-American worshipers in Charleston by Dylan Roof, and realizing that Dylan Roof was a baptized Lutheran, right? An ELC Lutheran and a member of a church in good standing. And when I really started digging into it, very much saw his white Christian identity was very compatible and actually undergirded his white supremacist manifesto that he was writing, even as after he'd been arrested and was in prison. Charlottesville, I think, also was a kind of turning point. In fact, I started writing the book in earnest after Charlottesville. It was just something I felt, but I think my parents played a role. They grew up in Jim Crow Macon, Georgia. But I think they played a role in not passing on that overt, white supremacy there, and even calling out my grandparents in front of me, when they would kind of come forward with just stuff that white Christians would just say, that were just outright racist, and I think put a little bit of enough of a barrier there that it gave me enough critical distance to leverage later, right? Even if it didn't quite all register at the time. But one just short thing I'll say is that at the beginning of writing the book, after Charlottesville, and this is maybe helpful for others, and one of the things that helped me was actually just to sit down and journal a little bit. And the only question I had in front of me as someone grew up in this kind of white evangelical world was, where does race show up for me in my memory? Right. That's a question only a white person can really ask, or has the luxury of asking that question, right? But the honest truth is, when I first asked myself that question, nothing came to mind. I had to sit with it a little bit, right? And that's the kind of privilege of being part of the dominant racial group. But once I sat with it, and just it was sort of like there was like one little thread, and like once I started pulling on that thread, it started unraveling other things, and then a story would come and a story would come, and then I think it was just telling stories with other people in my circles, with my family, that actually generated other stories. And I think that actually that kind of organic storytelling, truth telling, really is one of the things I think that white Christian churches can do, is just begin by just having some circles of telling the truth and trying to come to a kind of more honest view of our own history as a way of kind of awakening ourselves to responsibility in the present.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And I think, and I was going to say, one thing that stands out in that is telling the truth. I'm reminded of what James Baldwin says, and and he says, if we're going to get beyond this, that America has to learn to tell the truth. And so I'm struck with how sort of one of the seminal experiences for you was learning the truth of the Southern Baptist tradition, of which you were part, and then telling your own story and finding your own truth. Baldwin says that white people have to ask themselves the question of, what is the price of the ticket for being white in America, and then going back and tracing that story and telling that story and that truth about when I became white. And that's your sort of racial reckoning, and I, as you say, remembering the first time that you thought about race. And that's what Baldwin says, the first step is that white people have to go back and retrace the steps of when it was that I became white. And that can be the beginning of change. Let's make a little turn here. We're 2 months or so away from a significant election coming up. A lot of the work that you have done and research, and that PPRI has done, has been about the Christian vote, if you will, and the election. What role should the church, first of all, play on the public square when it comes to the vote? And I'll ask that together with, what is it about? What can we expect from the Christian vote?
Well, I think those are two really different questions, right? What should we see and what are we seeing? I think unfortunately really different. Like what I'll just say quickly about the should question. What I would hope we would see is, again, the church kind of opening up the aperture for people's moral vision and moral imagination. I think, instead of, and for white Christian churches, I think saying seriously, I think especially in election cycles, white Christians are so quick, I think, to say the Bible teaches, this is the biblical worldview demands, fill in the blank, right? And I would say this, like, having got it so damn wrong on issues of race, you know, it would be so great, right, if white Christians could take just a minute to say, yeah, all right, you know what, we got it so wrong. And to have enough humility, I think, and to have that be part of their job, right, is to say, we're going to help engender a kind of empathetic humility in our people, in our congregations. And if nothing else, right, we will say this, if we see our African-American brothers and sisters in pain, in anguish, and in anger over what they're telling us is injustice, even if we don't see it, even if we don't understand it, we would not dismiss it, right? We would sit with it long enough to see if we can muster enough empathy to get beyond our own kind of vision. I would love to see that be the role, right, that white Christian churches play in our current moment that we're having. Unfortunately, I think what we see, right, is that, and I think, you know, I think way back to Niebuhr, right, the social sources of denominationalism and this kind of indictment of kind of the way that race is, you know, he called it the kind of the caste system, right, in the Christian churches, and we're largely still there, right, and we have allowed, I think, kind of race and religion to be used as political tools, and I think there's no more damning, I think, insight to that, to just look at the composition of our two political parties, right? We have a Republican Party today that is 2/3 white and Christian, a Democratic Party that is 1/3 white and Christian, right? And how do we get to those two things? The story and the fuel, the propulsion that gets us there are divergent reactions to the civil rights movement in the mid-1960s, right? It's not abortion, it's not same-sex marriage, it's not other kinds of culture war issues. It really is over two divergent reactions to the civil rights movement, because we used to talk about the solid Democratic South. Whites were in the Democratic Party until the Party of Civil Rights, right? And then what we have is white Christian flight from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. And so now what we have, right, is this these two parties that are further apart than ever. And part of what's keeping them apart is this, that race, religion, and partisanship are all bound together in this really toxic way, right? And I think this is one of the reasons why we look at the same events and see completely different things.
That's right. And see different things. It's just, you know, to hear you speak of this sort of toxic interaction. And first, you know, I want to highlight that it's something you just said, that people goes right by people, that the Republican Party of today and the Democratic Party of today are not the same parties pre-civil rights, that they swap, so that the Republican Party of Lincoln is not the Republican Party of today. In actual fact, the Republican Party of Lincoln was, if today, the Democratic Party, because of what happened during the civil rights, that you get this complete reversal, as you have suggested, in this white flight out of the Democratic Party because of the positions and the support of civil rights. And with that, you get this, so you get a more, a majority white Christian party. And so how, you almost leave us hopeless in this sense, Robbie, of how we disentangle whiteness from Christianity, so that we can indeed, because a part of a faith tradition is to open us up to a more expansive moral vision, to open our imagination for justice up. But if you have this sort of thing that is whiteness stifling that, what's the hope for a white Christian faith tradition? I'm thinking of a church like my own that is well over 95% white. What's the hope? What do we say to the next generation? How can we disentangle whiteness and Christianity?
Yeah, well, it is going to be a generations long project. I mean, this was built over centuries, right? It was literally built into the DNA of American Christianity over centuries. So we shouldn't expect it's going to get dismantled overnight. But I am seeing that this, I think the civil rights, Reconstruction provided a moment of opportunity that we did not take advantage of. The civil rights movement provided an opportunity that we did not take advantage of. And I think the moment we're in provides another moment where the question is being called, right? It is out front. It is right in front of us. It's not, you can't really ignore that the question is being called. And the only outstanding thing to be seen is what the answer is going to be by white Christian churches. I am hopeful, though. I honestly am hopeful. I'm more hopeful than I was even when I finished writing this book last fall. I'm more hopeful now, even in the midst of all the kind of troubling things that we've seen. For example, in my home state of Mississippi, the Mississippi state legislature has voted to take the Confederate battle flag out of the state's flag. And what I'm most hopeful about there is that the Mississippi Baptist Convention, which is the state arm of the Southern Baptist Convention, right, founded to support the Confederacy and slavery, called on the governor and the legislature to remove the flag before they did it, right? So I think that's something I couldn't have imagined even 6 months ago happening. I write in the book about the monuments in Richmond that have been standing for over 100 years. They are almost all gone now. The statues are almost all gone. The church, the First Baptist Church in Richmond, that offered up its bell to be melted down for cannon, to make cannons for the Confederacy, rang its bell in celebration of the statues coming down this summer. Like, that's real change. Now we can't stop with just these symbolic efforts, but I think it's worth noting that there is a real effervescence happening right now. I think people do sense that the question is being called, that there is a responsibility, and that and then the other thing I think there's maybe a recognition that this is also not an altruistic project for white Christians, right? If we really take seriously how deeply embedded these assumptions of white supremacy have become in our own faith, like, we have something at stake ourselves. That's right, in kind of ridding the faith once and for all from this parasite that has really burrowed its way in, and we've kind of made motions toward getting rid of it, but like, maybe this generation will be the one that finally calls it out, right? And that puts and that hands something significantly different down to our children and grandchildren.
No, I think you're right, that this is a time rich with possibilities, and we have a responsibility to take advantage of that. And so, yes, and at stake, as James Baldwin once said, for white Americans, your very humanity is
our soul, right?
That's right. That's right.
Theologically, yeah.
That's right, and the soul of the nation. So, Robbie, my goodness, we could go on forever, and we are over, but I want to leave, though, with one question, because we are at this time of possibility. And that time of possibility begins at least with the vote, taking part in the opportunity to vote, our civic responsibility, if not our moral responsibility, to just vote. And so I want to ask you for a memory. And what is your memory of the first time that you voted?
Well, my parents were not that political, but they did vote. And so I certainly remember them, coming home with a little "I voted" sticker, and taking time to go to the polls and vote. I'll tell you, my first sort of a memory of kind of any kind of political activism was actually before I voted, was actually stuffing envelopes for Trent Lott, the Republican senator from Mississippi, in my early days in college. I mean, that was sort of my first, and again, I think it was a reflection of this kind of marriage between white evangelicalism and the Republican Party that had happened by the time that in the early 1980s, when that occurred. And then I think my first vote was cast for George H.W. Bush, is the first vote I cast. But I think what's significant about that is that for the moment we're in, is that I think voting for a non-Republican candidate had been so was seen almost as like something not even to think about, like that Republican identity had been so, I think, merged with Christian identity for me, who kind of grew up kind of with that rise of the Christian right era. And when I think back today, I think that's one of the things that stands out is it wasn't really a weighing of the issues or a weighing of the candidates. It was I'm white, I'm Christian, so I'm voting Republican, was kind of the assumption.
Well, it's a good place to end, I think. I want to thank you, Dr. Robert P. Jones, for your honesty, your provoking and inspiring dialogue and work. And I most especially want to thank you for and to recommend to all who are listening. If you don't have it, it is an absolute must read. And that is the book, White Too Long, The End of White Christian, and Robbie is also the author of The End of White Christian America. But I recommend to you today, White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity. He's only touched on a little bit of what's in that book, and it should indeed entice you into reading more, because we learn a lot about who we are as a country, even as we learn a lot about the Christian faith tradition. Thank you, Dr. Jones, for sharing your time, sharing your wisdom, sharing your work, and thank you most of all for your witness.
Thanks, Kelly, and thanks for all for your leadership and your witness as well. Always glad to talk to you.